welcome to the channel. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Now, as you can see in front of you, I do have the Pagani Design, the Doxa Homage, and the plan for today's video was very different. I was planning to do a full review. However, having checked out the reviews on YouTube, I know there's numerous there already, so I don't think I can add any other information for you guys. So instead, I'm going to jump straight into the comparison with the Seestern Doxa Homage. This, I can already tell, is going to be a very crucial comparison. It's going to be extremely close just by looking at the prices and the watches in hand. So this is going to be very interesting. As you guys know, I love doing these comparisons, and from what I gather, you guys love watching them also. So without further ado, let's get straight into this critical comparison: Pagani Design versus Seestern. Now let's start off by comparing the specifications, and as I said earlier, this is going to be extremely close, and throughout each category you'll see how close it gets. In terms of specifications, they are more or less exactly the same. You've got AR coated sapphire crystals on both watches, whereas the Pagani has a box style sapphire crystal and the Seestern has a flat sapphire crystal. Both are 316L stainless steel. Both do have a 120 click unidirectional bezel, and they both have bracelets which have milled clasps, solid female end links, and they are connected by a push pin. Yeah, so in terms of bracelet, more or less exactly the same. A very slight difference which we'll go into later on. In terms of movement, both use Seiko movements. The Pagani Design uses the NH38 movement, which is the dateless one, and of course Seestern uses the NH35. And in terms of water resistance, the Seestern comes with 200 meters of water resistance, and this is where they slightly differ. The Pagani Design comes with an alleged 300 meters. I've always said when it comes to water resistance, take it with a pinch of salt. I don't know if PD actually test them, and I don't know if Seestern actually test them, but it's better being safe than sorry. Okay, so specs are done. Let's move on to dimensions and see where they differ. So what you'll see, diameter is exactly the same. Both are 42.9 millimeters. Now in terms of depth, the Seestern is slightly thinner, coming at 13.8 versus 14 millimeters of the Pagani Design. Note that that's due to the box crystal. So without that, it could have been quite a bit thinner. If you look at the log to log, the Seestern has a 45 millimeter log to log, but also notice the end links, they are fully articulated, so that won't affect the log to log. But if you look at the Pagani Design, it is 45 millimeters on the case side. However, when we look at the logs, even though the links are individual, it's that second link that doesn't fully articulate, so your overall log to log becomes 51.4 millimeters. Now, if you go to the bezel size, again, exactly the same, measuring in at 38.6 millimeters. If you look at the crown on both, again, exactly the same, 6.9 mil on either one. Now, the bracelet, I think we get the next slight bit of difference here. They both are 20 millimeters at the top, and they taper down to 17.7 for the Seestern and 17.8 for the Pagani Design, so completely negligible. But if you look at the thickness, the Seestern bracelet is 3.5 mil thick on the links, whereas the Pagani Design is 3.8, just slightly thicker. The weight, again, pretty much the same. You've got 176 grams for the Seestern, and for the Pagani, we've got 172. So as I said, not much between them at all. So price, this is where it all boils down to. So if you bring up the paper slightly, so the Pagani Design retails currently, right, so today is the 3rd of October 2022, it retails at £142, which is going to be around 100 and maybe $50-60, and the Seestern retails at 167, so closer to the $180 mark, so a total of £25 or around, I think, $30 or $40 between the two watches. So now when we go further into the review, into the comparison, looking at each individual feature, I'll point score them. You guys should be familiar with the setup. So if I turn the piece of paper around, here's the template that I use. So I'll break down every element, the indices on the dial, the logo, the hands, the finishing style, the color, etc, etc. We look at the crystal, we look at the bezel, case, bracelet in a lot more detail, and then we'll just point score and then compare at the end, giving it a value for money figure, and let's see what the difference comes out to be, and ultimately if it's worth buying the Seestern over the Pagani or vice versa. So let's go ahead and look at the dial in a lot more detail on both pieces. Now, the way I score this is I'll be giving a point to the better value add feature. So for example, applied indices will win over printed indices because it costs a little bit more to have the index actually applied to the dial. It requires more machining, therefore, in my opinion, adds a bit more value. So we're looking at value add features. So when we look at the dial between the Seestern and the Pagani, let's first look at the index and the minute track. Minute track is applied to both. However, when it comes to the hour markers, the Pagani design does have 3D applied hour markers, and it's the more sought after feature. Whereas in comparison to the Seestern, it does have quite flat and printed lume applied hour markers. When we look at the logo and the font, now again, Pagani Design will take this one because it does have that applied Pagani Design logo, whereas Seestern's is printed, therefore just slightly cheaper. Now when I say cheaper, it might not be something considerable, it might just be mere pennies. Now the date window, yes, there is a date window on the Seestern, no date window for the Pagani Design because it does not need one, so therefore NA in that category. Now in terms of color, finish and alignment, both dials are finished quite well. Now this is where it comes to crunch time. Let's have a look at the lume. Now instantly you'll see the Seestern does have much more superior lume. Not only is it BGW9, it's also applied fairly well. It's not the best, it's not the absolute brightest, but it is more than adequate and is of a very high quality considering the hour markers are merely printed and they are quite flat against the dial. The handset lume on the Seestern is brilliant, and also you've got the addition of the lume pip which came in the version 2 and present in the version 3. Also additionally, Seestern do offer a lumed date wheel option, which Pagani Design, being a no date, won't have that option. Now when we look at the Pagani Design lume application, it is absolutely poor, extremely weak compared to the Seestern, very patchy as well. It is C3 or C1, but a very weak variant. Now considering it's got applied hour markers, still there's not enough lume applied, and funnily enough the handset seems to go a lot more duller than the rest of the hour markers on the dial. So that is extremely weak, very, very poor, and therefore it won't score against the Seestern in the lume category. So here's a visualization of that score, and as I scored it on a piece of paper. So overall, between the little micro categories on the dial, Seestern actually came up with 4, and the Pagani came up with 5. And what allowed that dial to win is because of the applied hour markers and the applied logo. I scored them separately and not the same, because sometimes you have applied logos and printed hour markers, and I think in terms of Seestern, and especially gauging all the community feedback, that is where one of the weaknesses lie, is the fact that the dial does not have applied hour markers, and it's something which a lot of you people actually called for. So dial overall, Pagani will take it, but a critical element of the dial, the lume, and a critical feature of a dive watch is actually extremely poor on the Pagani Design, and that's worthy to note. Then we move on to the Sapphire crystal, again applying the same methodology. The coating is AR on both. The style, the Seestern has a flat sapphire crystal, whereas the Pagani Design does have a box style sapphire crystal. It's got a domed underneath. So just going by, I think, the more expensive crystal, you will find that it is indeed the one used by the Pagani Design, and therefore PD will score 2 overall, and the Seestern will just stick to 1 due to the flat AR coated sapphire crystal. So as it stands, Pagani Design is indeed in the lead. Next up is the bezel. So we'll start off comparing the actual style of the bezel, the fit and finish, and the insert and the lume and the engraving, etc. before we move on to the rotation. Now when it comes to Seestern, clearly in hand you can see it is far more superior. Now some particular features that I want to point your attention to is first and foremost the finishing and the actual construction or sheening of the bezel. You'll notice they don't have a bezel insert, so everything has been engraved on the actual bezel, and it's been infilled with paint. Very precise, extremely well done. You've got brush finishing on the inner bezel, also on the outer bezel. Now if you look further into the actual construction, you can see the outer edge of that bezel where these kind of fins stick out. Really good for grip, again really nicely machined, but that top lip of the bezel, you'll notice it is slightly beveled, and then also the inner bezel, it does slope in. You also got the addition of a lume pip at the 12, as I mentioned, that came around in the version 2. So far superior quality in terms of the machining just on the bezel, clearly apparent, and yeah, that is a very nice bezel and a very high level of machining. Now when we compare that to the Pagani Design, it is relatively flat. If you look at the A face, you got circular brushing. However, you know, there is no slope on the inner bezel. I think the numerals are incorrect as well. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but that, you know, that depth rating, I think it's a bit all over the place. I don't know what it is. But in terms of also the sides, just look how like poor that scalloping is in comparison to what we saw on the Seestern. There's no real bevel around the edge. It's not even a polish. Yeah, so nowhere near the same level of build quality on the actual Seestern. So, but in terms of the actual numerals, the painting, the application, it is as crisp as the Seestern. But now let's move on to the rotation. So one thing you'll notice is there is quite a bit of wobble and play. I pointed this out in the unboxing, so you can just see that bezel just moving around, you know, within this axis, not secure. And the rotation is okay, you know, it is quite clicky. You do have a positive feedback from there. It is it's not too loose actually. It's adequate amount of, you know, pressure required to rotate it. And in terms of back play, you do have not much back play, but you've got a whole lot of bezel wobble, and that is something which doesn't feel nice. But you know, in terms of the previous bezels, I think this is the better one that they've produced. It does line up, however, just far too much movement in that bezel. That in comparison to the Seestern, all the Seestern owners know these bezels are absolutely amazing. First and foremost, the rotation does require just a bit more touch than the Pagani Design, but very nice feedback, really nice solid clicks, lines up, no back play, and you know, the bezel is very solid, really well seated within the actual case. So that's a no-brainer. In terms of, you know, I think every part of the bezel category, Seestern will take the win on this. Seestern will score all four in those categories, just due to everything being so well made, great rotation, and the lume pip. Now in terms of the Pagani Design versus, it fails on every single part, so therefore 0. And now Seestern is in the lead, and it is as quick as that. A small feature can basically tip the scales in either watch's favor. So next up, we are looking at the case. Now, when we look at the case of the watch, both watches have, of course, a very similar style of case. Both use a barrel style case, and they are finished more or less exactly the same. You've got circular brushing present on the A face, and there is a very slight difference between the brushing. The Seestern has just slightly finer brushing in comparison to the Pagani Design. You can just about make out when you look at the actual grain, and Seestern is just a touch finer, but nothing too significant. The real difference in the actual case is when you turn the case on its side. Now, the Pagani Design uses the case more similar to the Tactical Frog. A lot of you guys did actually prefer this style of case, and I must admit I preferred it too. Whereas Seestern's is quite thicker to the center. You can see it's quite bulbous when it comes to the center, and you've got a thick case back. However, Seestern is more in line with the actual watch it is homaging, whereas Pagani Design is slightly different. So therefore we need to look at comfort, and I must admit the Pagani Design watch case is a lot more comfortable on wrist. The watch seems to sit lower on wrist, and the weight distribution is a lot more even. Whereas the Seestern, due to that heavy weight, due to the thickness of the case, it does sit top heavy on the wrist. It is comfortable, but the Pagani Design is just a lot more comfortable, and you do have that top heavy wobble on the wrist. So the Seestern does of course come with drill lugs. However, the Pagani Design does not come with drill lugs, and a way for, you know, I think watchmakers to kind of score a point in this comparison, even without drill lugs, is if they offer quick release bracelets or straps. Now, of course, Pagani Design don't offer that option, so therefore they won't score in the drill lug category, and the Seestern will. Next up on the case is the crown action. Now, I made a big fuss of this when I reviewed the Seestern. The crown action is absolutely buttery smooth. It is a very standout feature of the Seestern, and a lot of you subscribers also can attest to that. The crown is just so good, effortless, buttery smooth. Also, you've got a signed crown. Now, when it comes to the Pagani Design, I don't know if it is down to this particular model or it's the same across the range, but I can only use the model I have in hand. The crown grip, first and foremost, is not the same level as the Seestern. You can see the splines are just a lot finer than they are on the Pagani Design, but no matter, the grip is present. They're exactly the same size. However, the action is so gritty. In comparison to the Seestern, there is a day and night difference. And you know, the more you turn it, rotate it, it just doesn't seem to go. And I definitely prefer the Seestern's smoothness on the crown action over the one on the Pagani Design. Now let's go ahead, look at the case back. Now look at the Pagani Design case back. You do have the image of a tortoise or a turtle. You got some sandblasted finishing, some polishing. You got the specs as you do on most watches, and you've got 300 meters of water resistance rating. And you know, it's a pretty normal case back. It is good. It isn't bad at all. The finishing is okay. It is smooth on the top of the wrist when you wear the watch. In comparison to the Seestern, there's just a lot more work gone into that case back. It's just a lot thicker. You've also got some sandblasting in the back, some polished features, and some deep engraving also with the specs, and it seems like a much more substantial case back. If any of these watches can do 300 meters, I'd say it would be the Seestern, just due to how, you know, heavy and well made that case back is. So it was kind of close in terms of the actual style of case. I gave both of them a single point. I think it's quite subjective which one you prefer. And then when it came to the finishing, Seestern scored the point for just for the finer brushing present over the Pagani Design. Not that Pagani Design is bad or is overly coarse, it just Seestern is just that little bit better. And the points for the drill lugs, that's present also. But on comfort, the Pagani Design took the point just due to how well it fits. Crown action, of course, Seestern took the point, as I said, and then the case back, another point for Seestern. So that gives you a total of 5 versus 3. So Seestern is still in the lead. Now we've got one more to go, which is the bracelet or the strap material, and let's have a good old dive into that. So in terms of bracelet, I think both bracelets are quite evenly matched. If we look at the end links, great fit and finish. As I said, they are solid. You've got beads of rice style bracelets. The brushing on both is exactly the same, more or less, and also the beads are highly polished in the center. I think the Seestern, as I pointed out earlier on in the dimension section, does have more articulation after the first end link, whereas that link seems to fold over just nicely, and every, you know, basically single link is actually separate within that bracelet, which is great for articulation and comfort on the wrist. Now the sides are polished. They use push pins to connect the links, but you can just see how nice that looks in hand. And also I mentioned that this is just slightly thinner than the one on the Pagani Design. So let's bring you the PD and let's have a quick look at it. Fit and finish, more or less exactly the same. And the difference here, in when we look at the beads, for example, the beads are slightly more rounded, slightly longer than they are on the actual Seestern. And the brushing, as I mentioned, exactly the same. There's no real issues there, and you got the polished sides. And the weird thing is, all the individual beads also articulate within the Pagani Design. However, it's just that second link that lets it down. So bracelets, for the most part, that's perfectly matched. I'm quite surprised that Pagani Design pulled out such a good considerable bracelet. Now the only other difference which you'll find on the actual bracelet is the clasp. Now Seestern uses the 4 micro adjust fold over clasp. It does not have any pushers, but just a flip lock, and yeah, it's a just slightly better clasp in my opinion, but I do wish it had pushers on either side. In comparison to the Pagani Design, it uses the old style of milled clasp. I really don't like these clasps. You've got 3 micro adjusts. It is flip lock. It does have the twin pushers, however it's quite short, and yeah, it's the older design. And had Pagani Design used the newer clasps that they use on most of their watches, you know, the one that just flips open with the twin pushers minus this flip lock, I definitely would have given the point to Pagani Design. However, this is a much more dated clasp, I feel, than the one on the Seestern. So in terms of everything on the bracelet, I think there's only 2 points where the Seestern bracelet is slightly better. One I mentioned on the end links, the second link down, and also just a slightly better clasp. And this is where Pagani Design just kind of let itself down on the clasp and the end link points. Okay, so we are ready to summarize. So totaling up the scores, so the Seestern's coming at 19 points and the Pagani Design coming at 13 points. Seems like quite a difference. It's a 6-point difference between the two. Now I don't know if you guys agree or not, but I've tried to go off just, you know, objective parts of each category. And 6 points versus £25 difference gives you a total of £4, or about $6-7 a point difference between the two watches. However, to summarize, I feel the difference between the two watches, and you guys making a decision, will be purely subjective. It will be things like the use of the NH38 movement. I much prefer that myself. I wouldn't want a date complication. I like more dateless watches. However, the lume is really crap on the Pagani, being all honest, and that Seestern is just a bit more refined on more or less every aspect. There's a bit more thought gone into it, but I know the case on the Pagani Design is a bit more sought after, as well as the applied hour markers. So in summary, I think if the Seestern used that dial setup of the Pagani with the same lume they currently use, that will be the clear-cut winner and probably the best homage to a Doxa out there on Aliexpress. And with the Pagani Design, it isn't too bad. Like I said, it is not bad at all. There's certain features, I think the main one being the lume, and that bezel is quite poor in comparison to something which, with only a £25 difference, it is just so well made. Therefore, it goes to show that Seestern has so much more value for money, and it is the better value for money brand in this comparison. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, you found it informative, and you know what, at the end of it, you guys can pick whichever one you want to pick. I'll link both watches within the description, so if you choose anyone, you'll still send some commission my way. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next video.